Good morning. We are going to continue in Romans 8, and I want to look in Romans 8:28, which is a famous verse and a comforting verse, but one that we need to think carefully about because I think sometimes in our minds and the way that it gets taught, it can get misapplied. So let's read it. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, the last clause, those called according to his purpose, there's more that's going to be mentioned about that calling in what is often referred to as kind of this golden chain, and we'll talk about that in days ahead. For now, I think it's best to focus especially on this first portion, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Oftentimes this verse gets thrown out as a kind of comfort verse for people, and that's not inappropriate, but I think we need to be judicious with it and careful with it, and here's why. First, I want you to note a couple of things it's not saying, okay? And that's what I want to focus on this morning. The first thing it's not saying that everything is good. So there are just genuinely bad things that happen. Just because God is sovereign, which we believe, which means he's in control of all things. It doesn't mean he causes all things, but it means he's in control of all things in that he causes some things and he permits other things. But nothing happens that somehow is taken him by surprise or that he is trying to catch up to in some way. With that in mind, it does not follow, however, that because he's sovereign, everything that happens is therefore good. If that were the case, there'd be no distinction between good and evil. So we first want to notice that bad things happen, and bad things happen to, quote, good people in the sense of people who are believers, people who are pursuing Christ. This verse is not saying that everything that happens is good. Secondly, it's not saying that everything that happens to everyone will ultimately work out for good. This is not saying that all things for all people work out for good. Instead, it's saying that all things work out for good, okay? Work out for good, have an end point that can be crafted to be good for those who love God. So this is a very specific verse. If you're listening to this and you love the Lord, you're his child and you're pursuing him, know this: hardship will happen, difficulty will happen, but take heart, because the difficulty and the hardship is not the end game. That it is doing something. It is forming something. Now, keep in mind, in this theology of the spiritual life that we've been looking at in Romans 5 through 8, you may have to go way back in your minds to the early thoughts for the day here. But in Romans 5, 3 through 5, you get a kind of chain of events, right? That suffering produces something, right? It produces this character in us and gives us hope, and because the love of Christ is poured out into us. Well, that has to do with the fact that suffering in and itself isn't good, but it is moving towards a good end because we love the Lord, right? Because we pursue him. So God has a sovereign plan. That sovereign plan includes suffering, but it doesn't include suffering as its end. And if you are his child, you can recognize that the difficulty you deal with does have a purpose. And that end point, while it may not be good in and of itself, that end point is something that God is fashioning for you, character-wise, end-wise, even in glory, working in a larger plan for. There's multiple threads to it, but you can take confidence that he is in the details. May the Lord encourage you with that.